Since I was little, I've been taught to read clocks with two hands, one for the minutes and one for the hours. But that's boring. How about something a bit more dystopian future, a bit more Blade Runner? That's exactly what you get from the NIWA Nixie, perhaps the most bizarre but cool watch you can get right now. And it costs a lot less than you might imagine. Let's find out what it is, how it works, and why Nixie tubes are literally capturing lightning in a bottle. The first thing to get out of the way is that Nixie tubes are not light bulbs. Whilst they share common principles, they go about producing light in a completely different way that makes them much more versatile. One shared element is the use of a controlled environment, a sealed glass container. Why glass? Well, the light would be pretty difficult to see if it were metal. Also, if it were metal, you'd generally have a lot more problems with loose electricity running about all over the place. Glass works well across the board because it's also an insulator. You know when you look up at a transmission tower and see the cables threaded with rows of discs? Those are glass. But these glass tubes have another function, to keep out our atmosphere and retain a different gas, or perhaps even nothing at all. A vacuum tube, a kind of bulb used in amplification, unsurprisingly has no gas in it at all. Back to the light bulb. It has a wire in, a wire out, a controlled gas inside, and adding electricity makes it glow. So how is that different to a Nixie tube, which also has a wire in, a wire out, a controlled gas inside, and adds electricity to make it glow? In an incandescent light bulb, to be specific, the wire in and out are connected by a very long, very thin wire. The thin wire, being thin, has a high resistance. Think of it like a whole bunch of electricity queuing up to get through a narrow corridor. The walls of the corridor resist the electricity, taking the energy from its motion and converting it into heat, kind of like friction. And what happens when you heat metal? It glows. That's why it's called incandescence, which means to glow with heat, like the word candle. Incandescence basically means it's really candle. It's such a volatile reaction that the controlled environment within the bulb is required to prevent the wire from basically rusting. Inert gases like argon are used instead for being, well, inert, which means they will behave themselves and not react. The lack of oxygen prevents rusting, known as oxidization, because there is no oxygen to oxidize. Make thing glow hot with fire, even inside a carefully orchestrated atmosphere, does seem a bit basic. An advanced species of aliens isn't going to be particularly impressed. So now we've got that out of the way, let's get back to the matter at hand, the gas discharge lamp. Sorry, we've still got a bit of a journey before we get to the Nixie tube. In 1675, that's 2 centuries before the light bulb was invented, French astronomer Jean Picard noticed something funky going on with his barometer. Had he not been an astronomer, undertaking his work in the darkest of conditions, he never would have seen it. When shaken, the barometer glowed, just bright enough to read by. You'll notice here that not only is the barometer not plugged in, electricity hadn't even been discovered yet. But it was involved. The mercury in the barometer was contained within a glass tube, which when shaken produced static electricity which somehow made it glow a faint blue. Now we're getting somewhere. Well, it actually took until 1857, once electricity was a thing people were aware of, for it to go somewhere. German glassblower Heinrich Geissler, whose descendants would go on to mastermind the prestigious Channel Cable Town, did what any good home scientist would do and started sticking things in the glass tubes he'd made and subjecting them to an electric current. It was down to Georges Claude in 1910 to turn Geissler's noodling into an actual product, using the inert noble gas neon in a glass tube to create an orangey red glow. You might be wondering about the other colours of neon, and I hope you're sitting down, because those aren't strictly speaking neon. Different gases are needed for different colours, for example argon for blue, helium for yellow, krypton for green, and radon for purple. Okay, so it's time for me to stop avoiding the difficult bit and explain how that actually works. Apologies in advance for ruining science for everyone. So like the incandescent bulb, you have a wire in, a wire out, an inert gas, and some electricity. But this time, those two wires aren't connected. What's going on instead is that the electrical energy is ionizing the gas. What does that mean exactly? Well, I can't tell you exactly, but I can at least tell you vaguely. Remember that corridor we were talking about earlier that the electricity was moving through? I kind of lied to you a bit because electricity doesn't really move through it like that at all. That corridor is actually filled with a bunch of stuff called atoms. In the middle of each atom are heavy particles, neutrons and protons, collectively called the nucleus. They'll be staying put. If they go anywhere, we've got a problem, like, I don't know, a nuclear detonation. Orbiting the nucleus are electrons. Those are lighter, but are kept in place because they have a negative charge, whilst the protons have a positive charge, binding them together kind of like magnets. There's usually an equal number of protons and electrons, making the atom neutrally charged overall, in what's known as its ground state. When a material is described as conductive, it means that it doesn't take much to break that bond and pull an electron away. So if at one end of that corridor you introduce a positive charge and the other end a negative one, that is, connecting it to a battery, you can override that bonding force. The measure of difference between the positive and negative ends is known as voltage. The atom closest to the positive end of the corridor will lose an electron, since that positive charge draws it out like a magnet. Now that atom has more positive particles than negative ones, so it acts like a magnet itself on the next atom along, stealing an electron from it to replace the one it lost, and so on and so forth all the way down the chain. That flow, called current, is measured in amps. That chain reaction can occur in a conductor like a copper wire, which is how we transport electricity, or it can happen in a gas like we have in a neon tube. Here's the important bit. When the loose electrons find their way back to an imbalanced, also known as ionized atom, the energy they absorbed to make the jump gets released again as light. And the greater the energy, the brighter the light. This is known as plasma, basically the same stuff as lightning. The colour is dependent on the gas that gets ionized, with each needing a different amount of energy to excite the electron in the first place. This is what Jean Piccard had seen in his mercury-filled barometer, the mercury gas ionized by the static charge into a faint blue glow. We're coming to the Nixie tube now, I promise. You've been very patient. So the two wires going in and out of the tube have a name, the anode and cathode. What inventors Hermann Pressler and Hans Richter realised in the 1920s was that the cathode could be shaped into pretty much any design, an idea that was refined by engineer Hans Biesou in 1934 to incorporate multiple shapes into one tube. It all came to a head when Saul Kaczynski, an engineer for Burroughs Research Center, completed numerical indicator experiment number 1, a long-lasting bulb that could display any number from 0 to 9 with the rich red glow of neon. He called it Nixie for short. But hold up. How does all the gas in a neon tube glow but only the cathode in the Nixie? Well, I'm glad you asked, because it took me bloody ages to figure out. Simply put, the energy required to ionize all that gas is not insignificant. Somewhere around 15,000 volts are needed. By the way, multiply amps and volts together and you'll know the power needed in watts. A Nixie tube, however, needs more like 100 or so volts, a lot less. And that makes sense, because otherwise a big bulky transformer is needed. So instead, to get the energy required, some subatomic particle ping pong has to take place. Atoms stripped of their electrons head towards the cathode, releasing more electrons that bounce back towards the anode, which then hit more stripped atoms coming the other way. The combined closing speed has enough energy to create the characteristic glow. Well, sorry about all that. You're here for the watch, really, but I hope at least that gave you a little bit more of an appreciation for everything that's going on inside this thing. Right in the centre are indeed two Nixie tubes, IN16 tubes to be exact, flanked by two IV15 vacuum fluorescent display tubes that work in a completely different way that you'll be glad to know I won't be attempting to explain. Both types of tubes are, despite the Nixie tube being a US invention, from the former USSR, where huge batches were produced before LED technology took over. There are some companies still producing new tubes, but most will be former Russian stock. They're hard-wearing and long-lasting, typically extending into the hundreds of thousands of hours. The NIWA Nixie delivers up to 3 months use from a single 3-hour charge, thanks to a customizable accelerometer that only turns it on when you tilt it towards you. That's not preserving the life of the bulb. Well, it is, but it's not needed. Rather, it's saving the battery from running out too quickly. The watch is charged on a USB cradle and set with, appropriately enough, a magnet. Tap the magnet on the right to enter setting mode, tap on the left to change the setting, and tap on the right again to move to the next setting. In order, you can set 12 or 24-hour modes, hours, minutes, seconds, and then the angle for the accelerometer to turn the watch on at. So there's this whole thing about the battery to prevent it degrading, since modern batteries don't like being completely discharged. At 10% battery, the blue lights no longer turn on, and at 3% all the tubes will deactivate. When it gets critically low, the board is disconnected and the program time is lost to get another month out of the battery before it turns itself off completely. Then, when it finally goes back on the cradle, there's a little red LED to let you know it's charging. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that this is not a beautifully refined product. It is industrial, agricultural even, and that's all part of the bonkers steampunk charm that's got you here looking at it in the first place. You can see wires, you can see circuit boards, you can see basically all the components that go into making this watch. The titanium case is functional, available in a variety of pretty raw finishes with the brand engraved on the side and all the gubbins kept in place with a carbon fibre case bag. The lugs, if you can call them that, exist simply to hold the strap on and are as decorative as a concrete bollard. The most challenging aspect of the watch is its size, limited by the smallest Nixie tube available, and at 55mm across by 17mm thick, that means you're getting into Pip-Boy levels of wrist presence. If you're looking for subtle, well, you wouldn't be looking for a Nixie tube watch, would you? It's a Doc Brown gizmo if ever I saw one, not quite from the past or even the future, in which Nick Holonyak never existed and the only form of outdoor wear is the leather duster. What's beyond discussion is just how pretty the Nixie tubes are. Whether you like the watch or not, the warm, soft glow is uniquely reassuring, without the deadly implications of the octogenarian favourite, the 3-bar electric heater. Looking at the tubes, I am at one with the moth, in full comprehension on why it is drawn to the nighttime bulb. I too have repeatedly headbutted this watch. There are some very well respected companies like Dalibor Fani and Milclock that produce some stunning Nixie clocks, but those all cost thousands, since the price of a Nixie tube rises exponentially with size. The NIWA Nixie, however, starts at $489, which is a very much more affordable way of getting some sweet ionization into your life. Maybe take the strap, either a Milanese or leather by the way, off and use it as a bedside clock instead. If you're looking for something perhaps a bit more refined than the NIWA, you'll have to pay for it because the limited edition Gelfman IN16, with the same tubes, will pull your pants down for a butt-puckering $7,756. At the other end of the scale, there's Nixoid, Tokyo Flash and other Etsy-based creators assembling similar things for around the same price. You're unlikely to find Tudor making something with old Russian glass in it anytime soon, but there's certainly choice out there. Make your selection carefully based on reviews, reputation and warranty. 5 years for the NIWA, by the way. So what's no bueno about the NIWA Nixie? Well, it's about as water resistant as a sponge, the wireless charging cable is an old style USB, and there's just no getting away from how big it is. In darker colours it's less noticeable, but it's never going to work seamlessly with an office suit or even jeans and a t-shirt. If you wear it, your friends will have questions, and many of them will be about whether or not you also have a Japanese pillow. So it's up to you whether or not you want to take what's coming to you on the basis that you get to enjoy the plus sides, of which there are many. Aside from the obvious benefit of getting proper functioning Nixie tubes in the cheapest possible format, there's also the added benefit of an extensive battery life, at least in comparison with battery-powered smartwatches, and the ability to enjoy it on the move. If those Nixie tubes have got your attention, then you know at some point you'll simply have to buy some, even if just as an oddity to have at home, that you never dare take even one step outside your front door with. Even for fans of traditional watches, there's still an appeal to be had in the Nixie tube. Aside from that hypnotic glow, it too is a mechanical engine, albeit one that operates at the subatomic level. Just like the springs and gears of a wristwatch, at one time this was one of the most technically impressive things ever conceived, and it's a pleasure to relive that notion all these years on. That's the NIWA Nixie watch. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into it and how it works. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thanks to my Patreons for making this possible. If you'd like to join them, you can via the link in the description. And remember, when working with high voltage electronics, keep safe by asking a neighbour or their kid to do it for you. See you next time.